Hello everyone and welcome back to JB's Total Gaming, where today we're going to be taking a look at how to play Dragonfire. Dragonfire is a cooperative deck builder for 2 to 6 players. Now for those of you who have played Shadowrun Crossfire, you're going to see a lot of similarities in this. However, I still think this video may be worth watching as there are some major rules differences and things added like locations and things like that. So why don't we go ahead and get into how to actually set up for the game. Now when playing Dragonfire, every player is going to be a character, and the base game starts with a pretty decent stack of different characters that you can play as. Now these characters are broken into Martial, which are the black class, here Devotion, which is the green, Deception, which is the red, and Arcane, which is the blue. Now this is going to be important for several reasons. One thing, you're going to take the marker of whatever type of class you are going to be playing. Now there are other factors that are definitely going to come into that, but this is going to be kind of your main class. Now when we talk about the different ways to set up, we'll talk about how you may end up being more than one class, but this is going to be your primary class for any cards that may mention that. Now on this card you're going to see several things. You're going to see what cards you're going to start with. So there is a deck of starter cards, and they basically just represent the 4 different classes, and each one of these starter cards is pretty much the same. They basically do 1 damage of whatever type they are. So you see here, as a Martial player, we start with several of the Martial cards and then 1 of each of the other colors. Now this also tells us how much gold we start with, and this can be a little bit confusing. You might say this says 2 experience. This is actually a spot to write in your experience. This is 2 gold, and then where you can put your experience. It's going to tell us how much health we start with, and our class and things like that. We're a human fighter, and our opening hand. So we're going to start with 3 cards in our hand at the start of the game that's drawn from this deck after we shuffle it up. Now there are going to be ways you can vary up what your starting deck is when you upgrade your characters. We'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the video, but just so you know, there are ways they can change that, but in general, these are the basic cards that you're going to start with. So we can go ahead and put this marker on wherever our starting health is going to be, and then these little dagger symbols will be used both on encounters and on our heroes to track when we lose or gain health. We'll start with 2 gold in this character, and one thing I do want to point out is I saw a thread about this on Board Game Geek. Basically, you may look at these and say the humans are just flat out worse than some of the other races when you compare them stat for stat as far as what they start with, or different abilities. They don't have any innate abilities like some of the other races do. However, they do start with a smaller deck size. So in case you're wondering, if you're a new player and you're looking at these and saying like, why would I ever play a human? Well, that's the idea. By starting with a smaller base deck of cards, whenever you purchase new cards throughout the game, you will get those a higher percentage of the time because of starting with a lower number of cards in your starting deck, which is kind of the advantage that humans have. Now when playing the game, you have to decide what type of way you want to play the game. There is a level 1 and level 2 adventure in the game that are basically designed to be replayable over and over again. So this is the level 1 adventure, and level 2 is for when you have more experience. There's a certain threshold of experience that it suggests your characters be over. Now there's also a campaign booklet that has suggested scenarios and a little bit of a story to go along with it. Whether you're playing from the campaign or just playing one of the 2 repeatable adventures, then they're all going to have a card like this associated with it. They're going to tell you what you need to do to set up, what encounter decks you need, basically the rules of the scenario, and also something to bear in mind is these replayable ones suggest that you can use different encounter decks if you want to. So while this one suggests you use the Dungeon Encounter 1 deck and the Dungeon Encounter 2 deck, maybe you play that once and then you want to mix it up with different monsters, whereas the campaign is designed to have certain types of monsters in order to fit the story. So what does that mean? There are several different encounter decks throughout the game, and they all have little symbols in the corner. Now, there is a key in the rulebook to tell you, but this is the dungeon symbol, so this is the Dungeon 1, and this is the Dungeon 2. Now, basically, they represent the difficulty of the encounters you are going to run into. So you would take these 2 decks, one being the primary and one being the secondary, and have them ready to draw encounters from throughout the game. Now, there are special rules if you're playing with any number of players other than 4 players. So, for example, if we have a 2-player game with an arcane character and a martial character, each character has to take on one of the other roles. So, we could have the arcane character take on the devotion, and then the martial character take on the deception. It doesn't really matter. You can decide which character is going to get which. Now, you're still this primary class for anything that refers to primary class. However, for skill checks or other things like determining where monsters are going to go, you are considered both of these classes. So if a monster were to attack the deception player on their turn, they would attack this player because they're both the martial and the deception player. So that's a pretty important thing. Something else you're going to do in a 2-player game is you're going to swap out one of your base cards for a bless card. Each character does this in a 2-player game. Now you may say, why is bless better than any of my other cards? Well, it does just do a green damage. However, it has an assist ability. Deal 1 damage of any color. Now we'll get into this more when we get into how you actually play the game, but assists are things you can play on other players' turns. And the reason this is important is we only have 2 colors represented here, so we're going to have a lot of cards in those 2 colors, but we're going to be short on the other 2. So by allowing us to take out one of our cards and put in a bless, we're basically giving us a better chance of being able to get the damage type we need in order to defeat a monster, which we'll see when we talk about encounters. So I probably would suggest taking out the card you have the most of and then replacing it with this bless so that you're in a better position to be well-rounded throughout the game. Now, if you're playing with 3 players, then only one of the characters has to take on a secondary role, and that character is the only one that replaces one of their cards with a bless, again, to give you a little bit more diversity in how you can attack. Now, if you're going to play with more than 4 players, if you're going to play with 5 players, then whatever the scenario tells you to do when drawing encounters, at the end of it, you'll draw 1 more encounter from the primary deck. If you're playing with 6 players, you'll follow the rules for how you draw encounters, but instead draw 1 more encounter from the secondary deck, making the game a little bit harder in both of those scenarios. Another thing to point out is that the game comes with these 2 markers for each of the colors. So if you were to play a 5-player game, maybe you'll have 2 of one class. So here's a second player that can be deception class. Now, and they can still both have that as their primary. However, if you're playing, say, a 4-player game and 2 players decide to be the same primary class, well, somebody still has to take on an extra class in order to basically trigger certain things like who a monster attacks or things like that. However, you don't get that bonus of replacing one of your cards with the bless. You basically have to take on that extra class so that all 4 classes are represented. However, if you're playing a 4-player game, you aren't going to have those bonuses. There is another bonus as well when playing with either 2 or 3 players in order to make the game a little bit more balanced. There is this Dragonfire deck, which obviously is the name of the game, that is going to be in every time you play the game. Now, normally you would start basically flipping over a card that is face up, and that would be the Dragonfire effect that you would start with whenever you would do that during your turn. However, if you are playing a 2-player game, the Dragonfire level, which we'll get into the Dragonfire level and how that works, actually starts at -2. So what I suggest doing is putting maybe 2 tokens on this and then taking 1 off whenever you would have to draw a Dragonfire card. And in a 3-player game, it starts at -1, so maybe put 1 token on there. So whenever you would trigger a Dragonfire card, just remove that token and don't actually flip 1 over until the tokens are gone. Again, basically slowing down the difficulty of the game to balance it more for 2 or 3 players. Now here we can see the game set up for a 2-player game. We have the 2 tokens on the Dragonfire deck like I talked about. We have each character with their health signified, their starting deck, their opening hand. Both of these characters happen to have 3 cards in their opening hand, and their opening money. We also have the adventure environment. We'll talk about this. It isn't a necessary thing to have, and some of the early copies of the game that were sold at Gen Con and whatnot don't have this card. I believe you can get it shipped to you if you want to. I'm not sure about the details of that, but that's, if you're wondering if you have the game and you don't have this card, that's why. Now, basically, this is saying that we're together in the basic environment. Again, this card is more for cosmetic reasons. You basically know when someone is in an encounter or not, and if they're not in an encounter, then they are considered in the adventure environment. But we put each of our characters' primary things here, and then left the other markers just to remind us what other class we represent. We have the primary adventure deck and the secondary adventure deck, and then we have the cards you can buy from the market. So at any point, you're going to have 6 of these cards available. They're going to have a cost in gold, and then their different abilities printed on the card. We'll talk about how some of these work specifically, but you're basically always going to have 6 cards in the market. Now, whenever we start a scene, we're going to do whatever it says here on this card. So all these cards are going to have different scenes you go through, and basically you have to get through all the encounters to move on to the next scene. So for this one, it says, we reveal encounters equal to the number of characters. So in this case, we have 2 characters, and we're going to go ahead and reveal 2 encounters. Now, whenever you reveal, excuse me, I just drew from the from the market card deck. So whenever you reveal an encounter, you'll take a look at the color of that encounter, and for the very first encounter, that color will go to the player whose role basically matches that. So this is a martial card, it'll go to the martial player. So we're drawing cards equal to the number of players, so we'll draw one more. In this case, we got another martial card, but we will basically go around the table and give one to each character in order to match that. But just as an example, I'm actually going to look through here real quick and grab an encounter so we can talk about that. Whenever a player has an encounter dealt to them, then that player is automatically moved to this encounter. We'll talk about the specifics of how the encounters work, but basically this character is now going to be at this location because this is a location encounter. In a lot of ways, locations work like other monster encounters, but there are some special rules for a character being there when these come up. So at this point in the game, we have a character who's still in the adventure environment, and then a character who is at a location. Now, there are certain rules as to if you have a situation that comes up that would put everyone in a different location, you actually don't allow that to happen. So hypothetically, let's say when we do have the Dragonfire token, this also represents who's going to be the first player in the first round. But let's say we had a situation where one player drew an encounter, and then in a 2-player game, the other player also drew an encounter, or excuse me, a location encounter. You would automatically just discard that, draw a new one, because you can't have a scenario where an encounter is going to draw to a player to where everyone's in a different place. The reason that's important is cooperation is a big part of this game, and while it is a little bit harder to cooperate when people are in an adventure environment and then in a location, the problem is characters basically cannot cooperate at all if they're in different locations. And if you have everyone in a different location, then that basically makes cooperating impossible, and that's a big part of the game. Also, another thing to point out is at the start of a player's turn, they can choose to move either from a location to the adventure environment or from the adventure environment to an existing location. However, at no point can you have one empty of players. So for the blue player to move on their turn, basically the martial player would have had to move to this location on their turn, and then the arcane player would be able to move back to the adventure environment at the start of their turn. So that's a big thing to remember, is that you can't have every character on separate locations, and you can't have no characters on a location. So now let's talk a little bit about the Dragonfire deck. So as the rulebook says, whenever you draw your encounters, next, during the first turn of any game, is going to be the Dragonfire phase. And in this instance, if we're playing with 2 players, we would just discard one of these tokens. However, let's say we were later in the game. We would reveal face up whatever card is on top of the Dragonfire deck. And then in general, these cards are going to have a negative effect on us during the game. So they also sometimes have abilities to trigger based on the Dragonfire level. So whenever you see this symbol and a number, basically this says if the Dragonfire level is at 6 or more, you are going to have this additional or different effect that's going to trigger, that's going to make things more difficult. Well, what is a Dragonfire level? So at any point when the Dragonfire phase happens again and there is a card on top of this deck, you will move that card to the side and then reveal another card. Now, at this point, the Dragonfire level is at 1. So it's basically the number of cards that have been discarded from the Dragonfire deck that represent the Dragonfire level. So at this point, the Dragonfire level is at 2. So that's something to bear in mind. Now, whenever you do beat a scenario, you actually, instead of discarding this card, you bury it at the bottom of the deck. Now, that can be pretty important because the rulebook in the game, and I want to talk about this specifically because it's kind of implied, but you have to read between the lines to kind of understand how it works. It says, oh, you can have a scenario where you run through most of a round with no Dragonfire card. The reason that is because even though it talks about how the first thing you do after revealing encounters is do the Dragonfire effect, technically every round after the first round, well, and including the first round, the Dragonfire effect happens whenever the player with the Dragonfire token starts their turn. Now, when you finish a scenario, let's say we ended a scene with the martial player going, then the next scene is going to start with the first turn being the next player. So every scene isn't going to start with the first player. We're going to keep track of whose turn it is and continue to go around as we play the game. Sorry, I guess I should be going clockwise. In this case, I only have 2 players and the one's over here. But it's going to be whoever finished a scene, the next player will start at the next scene. So hypothetically, if I were to finish a scene as the player with the Dragonfire token, with the first player in the first round, and then bury this card, basically we'd start the next round with the player to my left. And if, say, we were playing a 4-player game, we would have 1, 2, 3 players go, and then it would come back to me, and then the Dragonfire phase would trigger. So you, at that point, have no Dragonfire effects in play. So sometimes it may be worth, just a little bit of a strategy tip, not finishing off a round as quickly as you can, because players also draw 2 cards at the end of their turn. And basically, if you can delay without taking any or much damage, sometimes it is worthwhile to delay a little bit to have a good Dragonfire scenario, or just to allow players to draw more cards. So, like I said, the rulebook, I feel like kind of words that idea a little bit odd, so I wanted to go over how that works specifically. One more thing I did want to talk about, there is this symbol in the Dragonfire cards as well. This is actually called a deadfall, and this triggers when this card is placed in the discard pile. Now you'll notice here it actually says when this card is placed in the discard pile. So it's pretty easy to keep in mind, but I did want to mention that as another symbol you will see on here. And something else to bear in mind, if you were to basically finish a scene with this card on top and this card gets buried, then obviously that doesn't count as going into the discard pile, and that effect does not trigger. Okay, so let's talk about what players can actually do on their turn. So we'll go ahead and keep this half ogre that we drew to talk about how a turn works. Now, obviously, at the beginning of a player's turn, well, if they're a Dragonfire player, we have the Dragonfire effect, and any start of turn effects, wherever they may be, will trigger. Then the player has an option to play cards. So if we want to look at defeating this creature here, we can see these symbols along the side. So basically the grayed out circles mean 3 damage of any type, and then the next 2 lines, for example, this has to be a black martial damage, this has to be a red deception damage, and then 1 of any type. Now, when trying to fight a monster or an encounter in this game, whether it be a monster or a location encounter, you have to go through these steps in order, unless there is an effect that would basically that says specifically on the card that there's something else you can do. Now, another thing to bear in mind too is some of these monsters have what's called a surprise effect, and you will trigger that as soon as the monster is revealed. So whenever you look at a creature, a lot of the creatures have different special effects. So for example, the half ogre also attacks the martial character unless it's already facing that character. So in this example, we're fine. It's going to attack this character at the end of its turn no matter what. However, if this was on the arcane player, it would actually attack the arcane player who it's in front of and the martial player. But again, bear in mind, whenever you see a surprise effect, go ahead and trigger that right away as soon as you reveal a card. So in this case, we have to do 3 of any damage and then 1 specifically black damage. So here in our opening hand we have 3 cards. Now we can talk to other players, and the game says you shouldn't just show other players your hand. Now, but you can definitely talk about what's in your hand. I believe the game does that to encourage players actually talking and not just players saying, well, let me see your hand and I'll decide what you should do with your hand. Now for this example, let's just pretend we're at the same location. We'll get into in just a moment here what rules there are for players that are in different locations or on the adventure environment and the location and things like that. But right now, let's just assume me and the other player are both in the same spot, in which case we can help each other out freely. So during my turn, I could play cards to this creature, or if we were in the same location and let's say there was a creature that my opponent had with them, well, then I could actually play cards directly to my opponent's creature as well. I don't need to focus on just mine. And a lot of times it makes sense going after creatures in front of characters who have less hit points, which would be this example where I start with 10 and my partner starts with 7. So that's definitely something to bear in mind. Again, there are special rules with locations, but we'll get into that. But for this example, I'll just go after the creature right in front of me. Now, if my opponent, or excuse me, if my partner has any cards in their hand that say assist, they can play that on another player's turn. And it just so happened that they drew the 1 card in their deck that is an assist card. So they can say, I can help you out here. So when you play cards, you're going to go ahead and play all the cards you want to play. Now, there are some cards that you'll potentially buy from the market deck later on that have a triggered effect. So for example, this card here, this is kind of the most expensive martial card in at least the base set of the game. So Heroic Charge. For every martial card played, move 1 encounter from another player to you. That player draws 1 card. So whenever you have this where you have a text effect and then damage up here, you'll trigger the text effect first and then you'll resolve the damage in the resolve damage step. Now, if there is damage to be done here specifically, then basically that damage still resolves during the damage step. That all the damage is going to happen at one time after all the cards are played, but if there's any other effect, then you'll trigger that first, and then this will happen when you resolve damage. So in this case, because I have this and my partner says they're able to play this card, well, probably my best scenario is we can play all of these cards, and then when we resolve damage, we'll resolve it like this. These 3 will do the 3 generic damage, and then this will do the 1 black damage. So we want to basically figure out what's the most efficient way that we can bring down our opponent. Then obviously I will discard these cards and my partner will discard their card that they played into this battle. So then I can keep track of that like this. So we did the 3 damage and we did that damage. So now in order to finish this creature off, we're going to need to do a red damage and then any type of damage. So the big thing to bear in mind, like I said, if you have effects on a card that aren't damaged, trigger those, and then it basically goes into a damage pool. And then after all the cards are played, you figure out how you want to divide up damage amongst the card. Now, there are certain things that are really important to bear in mind. Now, one of the things that can happen is you can have creatures that have tokens on them. So, for example, we just happen to have one here. So, this Kobold pack has 3 tokens, and then these numbers represent how much health each token has, and then how much damage each token would do. Now, this is pretty important for several reasons. Now, one of the reasons that this is tokens are interesting is because each token is considered a separate encounter. Now, one of the reasons it's important that those are all considered different encounters is there are some rules about how you can divvy up damage. So, for example, if I were to play this card we showed earlier, we can see it has 4 total damage, 2 of them being martial damage. Now, you can always divide up damage between levels on one encounter. So I have 4 total damage, and 2 of them being martial, so I could definitely deal 3, and then 1 martial damage. That's fine, splitting up one card between multiple levels. However, you cannot divvy up damage between separate encounters. So, for example, if we were in a situation where, let's say this character, we were on a step that we needed to do martial damage, I couldn't use this card to say, okay, 1 martial damage will go to this encounter, and then the rest of the damage will go to this. So I can't split them up between cards. However, like I said, tokens are considered separate encounters. So we talked about how this character has 3 tokens that have 1 health and do 1 potential damage at the end of the round, or at the end of the player's turn. So in this scenario, I could not play this card and say, well, I have 4 damage, I'll get rid of these 3 1 health tokens and then do 1 damage to this, and then maybe play another card to deal the second damage to this generic damage. Because another thing to bear in mind is that if you don't complete a level of damage, so for example, if I play 1 card that hits this card after I've gotten rid of the tokens, well, that doesn't do anything if there isn't a way to get a second damage. That would any level, one particular level damage will basically heal at the end. I would have to complete that level in order to mark it off. And because these are considered encounters, they also have to be defeated first before I can actually damage this card. So consider these tokens basically to be at the top of the damage track, because remember, again, you normally have to go down the damage track in order. So while this card does 4 damage, if I were to play it against this encounter, I would only be able to use it to take off 1 token, because again, bear in mind that all of these are considered separate encounters and you can't divide damage amongst different encounters, so that probably wouldn't be the best play. Now let's talk a little bit about locations and what cards can be played when. Now, as I said before, cards that you play from your hand can be used to directly attack characters in front of another player as long as you are on the same location. So let's say that the martial character was going first. Remember, at the start of the turn, you can move from the base location to another location, or from that location back, as long as there's at least one other character on there. So in order to play a card that deals damage on the martial player's turn directly to another character's encounter, they would have to move. So let's say I wanted to damage this location card. I would move at the beginning of my turn, and then I could play cards that directly affect it. Now, if, for example, and normally in a 2-player game this couldn't happen, but let's say we were playing a 3-player game, and 1 player was at the base location, I was on a location, and the arcane character was on another location. At no point can you ever do any effect that goes from one location encounter to another location encounter. So that's just the steadfast rule that no cards at all can affect from one location to another one. However, there are scenarios where you can play a card either from the base location to another location, or from the another location back to the base location. So you can play assist cards in that way. So any card like that Bless that we showed that allows you to be played on another player's turn, you can do that from the main area to a location, or the location back to a main area. Again, you can never do it between 2 different actual location encounters. You can also do this with cards that have a text effect, as long as that text effect doesn't deal damage. So in general, you can't deal damage directly to another player's location if you're on the base location, or vice versa, directly with a card. Now, you can use assist on someone else's turn, but during your turn you generally can't do that. However, if you have a card with a text effect, that can still trigger between these 2 spots, going either way. So that may sound a little bit confusing, but basically assist can be played from here to here, back or forth. Text effects that don't have any damage icons in their text effect can happen, and that's about it. If you're in the same place, obviously you can play directly to enemy creatures, and if you're in 2 separate locations, you can't play anything at all. A couple more things to bear in mind. There are some cards that have basically a prerequisite in order to buy them. So for example, this card here, you have to have played a deception card in order to buy it. Now, there's something also that comes into play specifically for the martial player. So some of the martial cards you can purchase have this symbol on here. There's either 1 or 2 swords. And basically, whenever a martial player plays a combination of cards that allow them to get 3 swords showing, they instantly draw a card. Now this can be done on their turn or if they play enough assist cards. So again, here's a good example of it as an assist. On my turn this would just be 1 martial damage, but played on someone else's turn, and again I can play these between locations as long as it's not 2 different location encounters. It's a better ability. So the idea being that, you know, I'm throwing this javelin, it's better over a long distance, and I can actually throw it as an assist on someone else's turn for the assist effect, basically throwing it over that long distance, which is pretty cool. Now, something else that you want to keep in mind is at the end of your turn, any encounters in front of you will deal damage. So in this example, I'm here with these creatures. Now, another thing you want to keep in mind is, let's say, for example, I were to move here to help out the arcane player. Now, basically, any creatures in front of me are going to stay in front of me wherever I move. So if I move from one place to another, these creatures are considered to have moved with me, basically. Or if I were to move back, they will continue to be in front of me. There are certain effects that can allow you to move a creature somewhere else or encounter somewhere else, but in general, the things in front of me are always going to be in front of me. However, when I get to the end of my turn, basically whatever is still in front of me or any locations I'm on are going to deal damage to me. So in this case, if I didn't do any damage to this, because each one of these 3 tokens does 1 damage, and then this character does 1 damage, and then this character does 1 damage, and this location does 1 damage, I get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 damage. That would be really bad. So we'd hopefully want to deal with some of this. This would be a really bad situation. But that's something else to bear in mind. At the end of your turn, you're going to take damage based on the attack of all the creatures in front of you, including any tokens, and any locations that you are on, because a lot of locations will hit you for a certain amount of damage. Now, locations in general, though, are going to work the same way that encounters do. So maybe I move there so I could directly play onto this damage track. Now, there are some cards in the game that allow you to do levels of damage, which that can be very effective. So you know, this one does 3 damage, or maybe you just absolutely can't get another green damage. So any one of these is considered a level of damage, but you'll just see higher numbers. You'll see 6 and things like that on one level. So cards that do 1 or multiple levels of damage is pretty cool in a situation like that. However, if you ever see this symbol here, where instead of in a circle, so hopefully we can get this to focus here, but instead of in a circle, there we go, this is in a square. Okay, so first of all, this surprise, dispel magic, again, this will trigger as soon as this card is revealed, and basically that has to do with certain items that you may have in front of you that are magical items, and that's a whole thing that comes into leveling up and all of that, which we're probably not going to get too much into that. We're just talking about how to play the game, basically. But this square represents that this creature does not take level damage on this level. So if I did 2 level damage, I could do this and this, but let's say I had 2 generic damage. I couldn't do the 2 generic damage on that and then 2 level damage here and here, because this is immune to level damage. So we talked about taking damage. What happens when your character goes down to 0 health? Well, you can see here that it says stun. When your character is stunned, they are going to take an exhausted token and put it on that character. Now, being exhausted is pretty bad. Now, there are several other things that happens when a player is stunned. They're going to take all of their cards, whether it be from their hand or this card pile or their draw deck, and shuffle them all together in order to make a new draw deck. Now, at the end of a turn, you also have a refresh phase that we'll talk about, where normally you would draw 2 cards. But however, any exhausted players, including the turn that they get exhausted, they only draw 1 card during that phase, including the turn that they are stunned. A stunned character doesn't have a market phase, so again, we'll talk about the market phase at the end of your turn, but basically they don't have that, but they would still receive gold for any defeated monsters. Also, no feature abilities work while a character is stunned. Market cards with remains in play that were active when the player is stunned are discarded magic items that, again, you can get by defeating scenarios that we won't get too much into, but they, however, remain in play. They're the one thing that does remain in play. Now, last but not least, encounters facing the stun character remain in place. So even though I get stunned, these characters don't go away. Now, this is real bad because if I get stunned, or if I take damage again while I'm stunned, I go to being unconscious. Now, being unconscious is real bad. So, and I can also be unconscious if, let's say, I were to get healed up, and then I still have an exhausted token, and then I go to stun again. So either example, getting hit while I'm stunned, or going down to stun again while I am already exhausted is going to make a character unconscious. So this is pretty bad. So they again shuffle up all their cards into a new deck. However, they're out of the game until the end of the scene. Now, during a short rest, they'll have a chance to recover. We'll talk briefly about that as well. But basically, they're completely out. They don't do anything until they're able to recover during a short rest. So all encounters remaining, that character immediately rotates the player to the left. If a location facing the character went unconscious and no other class type markers are on that location, then discard it. So basically, these would move to the player to my left, but if I was on a location and there were no players on that location, then that location does go away if I am knocked unconscious. If a card indicates an effect for a class type no longer active during the scene, because they've become unconscious. So basically, a card triggers and it goes to, say, the martial character, but hey, the martial character isn't in it anymore, then randomly decide where it applies. So basically, if we draw a martial encounter, it still has to go to someone, but we randomly decide where that's going to go. Now, the last two steps to a player's turn are the refresh phase and then the market phase. So in order to get money to buy cards, well, this character starts with 2, so they may be able to buy some things. However, whenever an encounter is defeated, there is a gold value. Now, obviously, this encounter isn't considered defeated until we get rid of all the tokens and then the actual card. However, this character has 4 gold on it. So how that works, whoever is the active player, doesn't matter if someone kills this creature with an assist, whoever is the active player will get 1 gold, and then we'll go around to all the players. So in a 2-player game, the player that's active would get 1, then the other player. Player that was active, then the other player. In a 4-player game, everyone would end up with 1, but you can definitely end up with uneven. And that's how the gold is distributed whenever an encounter is defeated. Now, at the end of a player's turn, unless they are exhausted, they will draw 2 cards, but only if they have 3 or less cards in their hand. So sometimes it may be worth playing a card that maybe you might want to, it's not necessarily the most optimal to play, because by playing 1 card when you'd have 4 cards left, well, you're going to draw 2 cards. So again, if you have 3 or less cards in your hand, you'll draw 2. So that's something to bear in mind, is that when you're not going to go through your deck as quickly in this game as you would in other games and cycle through it over and over again. So after the refresh phase, we have the market phase. At that point, you can spend money to buy 1 or more cards from the market. Now, once you buy a card, go ahead and immediately replace that card. So if I were to buy that for 2 and I had more money, then this would now be an option. So there's always going to be 6 options available to you. Also, during this market phase, you either buy a card or you rotate a card. So if you decide not to buy a card during the market phase, in order to keep the market fresh, you first reveal the next card on the market deck, and then you replace one of the cards already in the market deck, discarding it, and then replace it with that card. So you're always going to cycle at least 1 card no matter what. Now, eventually, we'll defeat all of the encounters in front of us, and then that's the end of a scene. Now, like I said, that's kind of nice because the Dragonfire deck, whatever is on top of it, will get buried as opposed to discarded, which is a nice thing. And then also, we are able to take a short rest in between scenes. Now, we take a long rest after we defeat it, which again, Dungeons & Dragons terminology here, but let's talk about what happens during a short rest. One more thing I wanted to mention before we talk about a short rest is if a character is stunned and then they're healed at any point, so let's say there's an effect that heals a character for 2, they automatically draw 2 cards right as it happens, even if it's not on their turn, and they are no longer considered stunned. Now, they're going to keep that exhausted token, though, and we bring this up because one of the things that happens during a short rest is you get rid of any exhausted tokens, which is nice. Another thing that happens is as long as you have the ability to heal, you heal 1. So that also is pretty nice. Now, also at this point, starting with the player to the left of whoever ended the scene, so whoever's going to be the first player in the next scene, each character or each player will have an opportunity to buy from the market. Now, you can buy or not buy during this extra market phase, and if you choose not to buy, you don't cycle out a card at this point. It's only at the end of your turn when you do that. Lastly, there is another special rule that, unless specified otherwise, features and magic items in play cannot be used during a short rest. Again, magic items are things you can get as rewards, and just bear in mind that they normally can't be used at this point. So what happens when we finish an entire scenario? So if we look at the back of this card here, you can see we complete the adventure when defeating the 3rd scene. And at that point, we take a long rest as opposed to a short rest. And basically what that means is we get experience and magic items. Now, each different scenario is going to have rules as to how much experience the players get, and you'll want to keep track of that for each individual character. And then it says here to follow the standard rules for getting magic items. Basically, there's a chart in the rulebook that explains, based on the difficulty and things like that, the rarity of magic items you get. So, for example, the magic item deck involves, and I don't want to show all that off and spoil everything, but there's like common and rare and ultra rare, whatever they're called, cards that you can get, and then you would take the cards that would apply to the characters. So, for example, let's say they were to get 1 common and 1 uncommon. Then you would shuffle up the common deck, give 1 to each player, and then shuffle up the uncommon deck and give 1 to each player. And those are cards that are added to your deck to be used in the next scenario. Some of them are used once and they go away, some of them you hang on to. So the magic items are pretty interesting. Now, you want to keep track of your experience because you're going to want to spend that experience upgrading your character with these stickers. So all of these feature slots here, so we also talked about features. Actually, maybe it isn't called features. I'm not sure on a character that has a special ability here, but features are here as well, where basically we're going to be taking these stickers and be putting it onto our character. So you can always check at any given point, because you don't have to subtract from your total experience when you are getting features, because the way it works is you'll always keep track of your total, and then at any point you can compare with what you have. There are some backgrounds that are free that you can start with if you so choose, but we eventually get into cards that cost, so for example, these cost 5 experience, as you can see, but we can get cards, the highest value in the base deck are 100 experience, so that's a whole lot of experience. But basically you can choose these and put them on your character at any point. Now, if at some point you decide you want a different ability, let's say you end up at a point where you've saved up a bunch and you have 80 experience, and maybe you already have something that costs 20. If you want to, you can actually take this 100 cost one and then put it over top of that one. So you're not stuck with that necessarily. So basically, because the difference between that 20 and 100 is 80, with if I had 80 experience left over, I could do that. At any point you can check how much the experience of the things you have are worth, and as long as they're not over your experience you have here, then that's fine. There are certain things of these that work almost like a skill tree, in that you have to have certain prerequisites in order to get. So you can definitely spend some time looking through these and deciding how you want to set things up. And again, we're not going to go into all of the details of that, but that's basically how the experience works. So there you go. There's pretty much everything you need to know in order to play Dragonfire. We could spend more time going over every little detail, talking about specific cards. And like I said, I don't really want to spoil the Magic deck or anything like that. But that should give you a pretty good idea of how the game actually plays. And I tried to point out specifically those special things that might have been a little bit difficult to understand in the rulebook, like how the Dragonfire phase works, and you don't always start a new scene with that. It's when that player starts their turn, and some other things as well, like as far as it's just tricky as to when you can play cards in and out of encounters and things like that. But hopefully that gives you a good idea of how the game plays. One thing I do want to point out, while we didn't stop and go over, specific cards or things like that, there is an errata to the game, and it's pretty easy to find. If you just search Dragonfire errata, it should be the first thing that pops up on Board Game Geek, where one of the designers actually says, like, hey, here are some things that have changed, here's some explanation on things. And it's pretty important, some of them. For example, the very first encounter, I believe it is, in the scenario booklet, they changed something to make it slightly easier that has to do with the tokens. That's all stuff you probably want to check out to kind of help with some game balancing and some understanding of that. So thanks a lot for watching, everybody, and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye!